What are some facts about Ludwig Wittgenstein's life?
Quite a lot is known about Wittgenstein's life, although not everything is completely understood. Some stories seem to be in the realm of legends. Wittgenstein was born in 1889 in Vienna, Austria, to a famous and wealthy family of Jewish ancestry. His paternal grandparents were Jews who converted to Protestantism. And his mother was Catholic, although her father was of Jewish descent. Ludwig was the youngest of 8 children, who were all exposed to high culture. Composer Johannes Brahms was a friend of the family. Although Ludwig was baptized as a Catholic, when he confessed his sins to friends later in life. Among his admitted transgressions was the fact that he allowed others to assume he was not Jewish. Ludwig had 4 brothers, 3 of whom committed suicide. When his father died in 1913, Ludwig inherited a vast fortune, which he gave away. In 1938, after Germany annexed Austria, he was able to protect his sisters from being sent to concentration camps by giving the German government millions of dollars in gold. Wittgenstein's education included studying mechanical engineering in Berlin. In 1908 he moved to England to study aeronautics, which included experimenting with kites. This led to mathematics and then to philosophy. Insofar as it was a current pursuit to seek the foundations of mathematics in logic. A visit with the mathematician Gottlob Frege, 1848–1925, led Wittgenstein to meet Bertrand Russell. 1872–1970, at Cambridge University, where he studied logic with both G. E. Moore. 1873–1958, and Russell. But his studies were interrupted by World War I. During which he volunteered for the Austrian army and distinguished himself for bravery. Russell assisted Wittgenstein in publishing Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1922. Wittgenstein then taught elementary school in a rural area of Austria and also designed and built a modernist house in Vienna for his sister Gretel. Returning to Cambridge in 1929, he taught philosophy. Becoming a professor at Trinity College 10 years later. He was a hospital porter during World War II and resigned his professorship in 1947. Moving to Ireland to write. Just before dying, he said, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Ray Monk's biography Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius, 1991. Is considered definitive as both an intellectual and personal account of Wittgenstein's life.
What was unusual about Hume's theory of the emotions?
Although Hume exalted reason over faith when it came to knowledge. When it came to human psychology, he believed that we are primarily motivated by our emotions or passions, and that reason is always in the service of these emotions. That is, unlike Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, he did not have a cognitive theory of the emotions. according to which what we feel is the result of what we believe. Hume wrote, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions."
What was Robert Boyle's atomic theory?
Boyle, 1627 to 1691, claimed that the things in the world studied in physics, chemistry, biology, and inquiries into gases and fluids were all made up of atoms. He thought that because atoms could be used to explain and predict what was observable, their existence was an empirical matter and not the results of pure speculation. Unlike Gassendi, who was content to suspend judgment on whether atoms existed, Boyle claimed that atoms did exist, using the method of transdiction.
In his case, it was, why should a human being not commit suicide?
The question arose for him from his apprehension of the human condition as absurd. Together with the absence of God and a forever frustrated search for meaning. Camus was a friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905-1980, but they became alienated from each other as a result. Of Camus' critique of communist tyranny in his essay In Favor of Revolutionary Struggle, The Rebel, 1951. His novel The Plague, 1947, dramatized the ever-presence of death in human life. In his non-fiction essay The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, Camus claims that meaning can be found by affirming the absurd and then rebelling against it, as in Imagine Sisyphus Happy. Sisyphus' punishment by Zeus consists of eternally rolling a large boulder up a mountain, only to begin again after he has reached the top and the boulder has rolled down again. His crimes were first to put death in chains and then escape death himself. Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. His own death in a car crash raised the question of his suicide. Paul Ricoeur, 1913 to 2005, wrote on a variety of subjects, including existentialism, phenomenology, ethics, psychology, and theory of language. All of his work was distinguished by a deep engagement with key figures in the history of philosophy. His Freedom and Nature, 1950, was received as a rejection of Sartre's theory of freedom. Ricoeur argued that willing always has an involuntary component, which works as a kind of built-in resistance. What is voluntary consists of motive, decision, and consent, each of which has its own involuntary moment. The involuntary moments include birth, death, character already developed, the body, and the unconscious. First, it's not clear that Sartre equated freedom with acts of will, because freedom is present in all consciousness. Second, Sartre would have said that what we accept or recognize as involuntary requires a free choice of bestowing that particular meaning.
Was the Ptolemaic theory merely a matter of religious faith?
No, the idea that Earth was the center of the universe was not based just on religious belief. The Ptolemaic theory, constructed by Ptolemy, 90 to 168 CE, did a fairly good job of describing both sensory experience and astronomical records and calculations that went back several thousand years. The movements of the heavenly bodies, which were themselves believed to be made of different and more ethereal stuff than Earth, could be more or less accurately predicted, according to this theory. It was also in accord with the existing natural philosophy that everything was made up of earth, water, fire, and air, in an ascending hierarchy. However, Ptolemy's assumption that Earth was stationary required a postulation of 80 epicecles to save the appearances, which means that new complicated postulations were necessary to make the theory match observations.
What are some of the main themes in philosophy of biology?
Philosophers of biology are interested in how biological explanations differ in form from explanations in the other sciences regarding whether the behavior of living things can be predicted, and in how environment, genetics, and processes of development interact to result in organisms. They are also interested in evolutionary theory. Useful texts in philosophy of biology include Alexander Rosenberg, Structure of Biological Science. 1985, Elliot Sober, The Nature of Selection, 1984, and Michael Ruse, Philosophy of Biology, 1973. Most contemporary philosophers of biology rely on Ernst Mayer's The Growth of Biological Thought. Diversity, Evolution, and Inheritance. 1982, and Towards a New Philosophy of Biology, Observations of an Evolutionist, 1988. Additional thought by biologists have also resulted in new perspectives on biology that include work by Patrick Bateson, Richard Dawkins, Jared Diamond, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, John Maynard Smith, and Edward O. Wilson. Also, evolutionary biology has inspired new philosophical systems of thought, for example, by Daniel Dennett.
What is the Brights movement?
The Brights movement is committed to promoting public understanding and acknowledgement of the naturalistic worldview. Chicago biology teacher Paul Geisert and Manga Futrell, an educator who is also a board of directors member of the American Humanist Association and a former president of Atheists and Other Freethinkers. Founded it in 2003. Futrell defined a Bright as an individual whose worldview is naturalistic, free from supernatural and mystical elements. The Brights movement motto is illuminating and elevating the naturalistic worldview. The organization has three major aims: promote public awareness of the naturalistic worldview. Achieve recognition that individuals who hold this worldview can behave in principled ways in important civic matters. And educate all members of society to recognize and accept the participation of brights.
Who was Hypatia of Alexandria?
A philosopher and educator who achieved lasting renown, Hypatia of Alexandria in Egypt, c. 350 to 415, became famous throughout intellectual communities for her abilities in Neoplatonist philosophy and mathematics. In the Neoplatonic tradition, Hypatia used mathematics as a path toward understanding the higher world. In Theon, Hypatia's father comments on Ptolemy's Almagest, which set forth the geocentric model of the universe. And he credits her for the work of Book 3. Although Hypatia was a pagan, the Roman Christian Egyptian government appointed her head of a school of Plotinus. Hypatia held that post for about 15 years, teaching both male and female students. She was said to have been very beautiful and was much admired personally. Signe Sues, c. 373 c. 414. Her pupil, who was to become Bishop of Tamame, conveyed her views in essays, hymns, and letters. She was the heroine of Charles Kingsley's 1853 novel, Hypatia, or, New Foes with an Old Face. Hypatia was associated with Alexandria's prefect, who was opposed by Saint Cyril of Alexandria. c. 378 to 444, the militant archbishop. As a result of her involvement in that dispute, Hypatia was hacked to pieces with sharp shells and her body burned by a mob of Christian monks. The contemporary feminist philosophy journal, Hypatia, is named after her.
Why do some people consider Martin Heidegger to be an existentialist?
In Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger analyzed the human being or Dasein, which in German means being there. Heidegger's insight was that Dasein cannot be understood as a biological thing because its main objects of concern, which is a fundamental structure of what it is, are always somewhere other than where Dasein itself is. Although Dasein in its being is concerned for its own being, understood in the ordinary sense as life, its own being is caught up in the world. Furthermore, Dasein fails to understand its own being authentically, because in its ordinary existence it accepts the interpretation of its being that has already been constructed by the they, or the mass mind. The they is particularly mistaken about the nature of death.
What did Descartes do once he was sure of his assertion I am thinking, therefore I exist?
Descartes asked himself what kind of thing he was and concluded that he was a thinking thing. That is, a mind-soul, and not the author of his own being, who must be God. God created both Descartes as an immaterial thinking thing, or soul, and the physical universe that included Descartes' body. There was a second proof for God's existence in Descartes' ontological argument. God was all-powerful and all-good, existence was better than non-existence, therefore God existed. Because God was good, he could not be a deceiver, and the earlier doubts about the existence of the external world, and the validity of logic and reason, were put to rest. The doubts about sense data could always be corrected by further sense experience. And the distinction between being awake and being asleep could be solved after one was awake and compared the two states. God had made mankind such that our perceptions of the reality of a world that existed could be trusted.
What was new in Hume's views on religion?
In his dialogues concerning natural religion, c. 1750s, Hume argued against both a priori and empirical proofs for the existence of God. This was an attack on rational grounds for religious belief. His argument against a priori arguments, or the ontological argument used by René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, was to claim that nothing that exists can exist necessarily. That is, it is not a logical contradiction to assert the non-existence of anything, including God. His empirical arguments were mainly directed against the cosmological argument and the argument from design. Against the cosmological argument that held the world must have had a maker, Hume claimed that we do not have enough knowledge about the origins of worlds to justify a hypothesis about how this one came about. The argument from design held that just as things such as houses and watches must have builders, the world, insofar as it works well within itself, must have a designer. Hume's response was that we have no grounds to reason from what is true of any one thing within the world to the entire world itself. If Hume's arguments hold, then the only grounds left for religious belief are those of pure faith.
Was Immanuel Kant an important figure of the Enlightenment?
Yes, Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, was more intellectually influential in the 19th century and beyond than any other Enlightenment philosopher because he constructed a system of reason from which empiricism and the sciences could be derived. Kant thereby, theoretically, ended any residual tensions between rationalism and empiricism because his rationalism allowed for empiricism. In that sense, he was the epitome of the age of reason. Of course, for those who ignored Kant, the business of philosophy remained empiricism. Idealism, or rationalism, as usual.
What were the important ideas of the Sophists?
First and foremost, the Sophists were in revolt against the pre-Socratic idea that there is some ultimate reality that is unlike what we perceive and experience in the ordinary world, but in some sense causes what we do perceive and experience. The Sophists elevated the importance of the world that appeared to exist for human beings. Or as the 20th century philosopher Jürgen Habermas, b. 1929, famously called it, the life world, although Edmund Husserl 1859–1938 originated the term. They all thought that virtue can be taught, which meant that anyone could participate in government, regardless of their wealth or social class. In that sense, the Sophists enabled ancient Greek democracy. The Sophists insisted that moral beliefs should have rational reasons and be capable of defense in rational argument. In sophistic treatments of morality, human nature was often opposed to society or convention, and the Sophists were on the side of nature. Finally, it should be noted that the Sophists practiced in an oral tradition, which Socrates was to bring to a level of elegant perfection that no single philosopher or school has equaled in the millennia since his death.
Who is Helensixus?
Helensixus, 1937, is best known to philosophers for her The Laugh of the Medusa and Sortes, both 1975. These works constitute an anti-essentialist exhortation for women to reclaim their bodily experience in a new form of feminine writing, écriture féminine. Sixus has been interpreted to advocate bisexuality and multiplicities of sexuality in ways believed to have prefigured queer theory.
How did Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe help complete the Copernican revolution?
Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, composed a mathematically precise theory of the Copernican system, and Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, furnished the measurements that constituted the factual data for the Copernican theory. Kepler's theoretical work was what completed the Copernican system. Kepler offered a religious explanation for the spacing of the planets and postulated a driving force centered in the Sun, which diminished with distance, as the cause of planetary movement.
What were some of Leibniz's original contributions to philosophy?
Leibniz's major works include the Monadology, 1714, Discourse on Metaphysics, 1686, Theodicy, 1710, and the Leibniz-Clark Correspondence, 1714–1715. As well as political writings and a large body of unedited material. Leibniz had a very complex view of the universe that defied common sense. was theoretically fascinating, and preserved core Christian beliefs. His philosophical writings were highly complex and had their own terminology. He claimed that his philosophy was based on these general principles: principle of identity, principle of the best, principle of sufficient reason, metaphysically necessary principles, principles of order, principles of causation, and the principle of the natural. In addition to this, he used the idea of monads as the basic unit of what was real.
Has anyone succeeded in refuting Anselm's ontological argument?
Many philosophers believe that Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, killed Anselm's argument with his claim that existence or being is not a predicate or a quality that a thing can have or not have. But other philosophers continued to debate both Anselm's and others' forms of the ontological argument.
What was John Rawls' theory of justice?
Rawls, 1921–2002, began by positing justice as the cardinal virtue of society. All societies value the concept of justice in a primary sense. Although they have different conceptions of justice. Rawls' conception of justice was that it can be understood as fairness. On that model he proposed that a society would be just if its fundamental institutions were just, which would entail equal access to official positions. As a way of determining how fundamental institutions could be just, Rawls proposed a thought experiment that posited an original position. In the original position, the framers of just institutions would do their work behind a veil of ignorance. This veil of ignorance would prevent them from knowing their own positions or interests in the society whose institutions they were framing. Rawls wrote, "No one knows his place in society, his class position or social status. Nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance." Rawls' thought experiment guarantees a hypothetical condition of disinterestedness on the part of original framers. This posits them as Kantian rational agents, who, because they are autonomous or self-ruling, can and should make choices about what is most important in their lives. That they do not know their personal interests but nonetheless frame institutions that will affect everyone's personal interests is fair in the same way as having one child cut a piece of cake and the second child choose the piece she wants. The premise that individuals with interests in society consent to the basic institutions echoes the necessity for the consent of those governed in social contract theory. Social contract theory is also based on the premise that Government must justify itself as beneficial to those governed. Rawls' original position promises a test of even greater benefits than allowed by original social contract theorists, such as John Locke, 1632–1704, who assumed that only property owners would be represented in government. Rawls' model permits us to ask whether anyone in society who could be represented behind the veil of ignorance would choose a given state of affairs. If not, then that state of affairs is not just or fair.
What influence did Ludwig Feuerbach have on others?
Feuerbach directly influenced Karl Marx, 1818–1883, and many others. His philosophical starting point of the existing individual predated existentialism. His ideas of how a religion should be studied made possible sociologies, histories, and other non-religious studies of religion.
Who was Walter Benjamin?
Walter Benjamin, 1892–1940. Is highly regarded for the ways in which he combined Jewish religious insights with Marxism. He died from taking morphine pills in Purtbu on the French-Spanish border, while traveling with a group of intellectuals escaping from the Nazis. Different theories have been advanced about his death. That he committed suicide to avoid torture by the Gestapo for himself and his colleagues, or that Stalinists killed him. Benjamin was Hannah Arendt's, 1906–1975, first husband's cousin. Before he died he gave Arendt the manuscript to his The Concept of History, 1939. Which she gave to Theodor Adorno, 1903–1969, who had it published in the United States. In his major work The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, 1936, he combined Jewish mysticism with Marxism. Benjamin thought that logic was limited as a philosophical tool because in modern times the philosophical is best accessed through literature and music. He was studied mainly for his theories in musicology, until his work was recognized to be highly relevant for postmodernism in the late 20th century.
What was Hobbes' belief about free will?
In his The Questions Concerning Liberty, Necessity, and Chance, 1656, Hobbes called his position on free will necessitarianism. He said there was nothing in the human mind to which the word will refers. In other words, there was no will. But there is desire. And what we call will is the last desire before we make up our minds to do something. The entire person can be free, however. Human freedom, according to Hobbes, consists in not being prevented from doing what one desires to do. Freedom, in his view, is thus nothing more or less than liberty. Hobbes also believed that all actions have causes or are necessitated. But we are responsible legally for what we do because it is just that we be punished for our decision or will in the matter. The purpose of such punishment is to deter others from misbehaving and preserve justice.
Did the study of some of the sciences get their start in philosophy?
Yes. Until the end of the 17th century, the physical sciences were called natural philosophy. And until the 19th century there were no social sciences. Social science work was done under the name of philosophy. Many sciences have their roots in philosophical debates. Western science began with the pre-Socratics in the 7th century BCE. The pre-Socratics were the first Westerners in recorded history to think about the world using reason instead of myth. Much later, Western science got another big boost from Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727. Who practiced what was then called natural philosophy and persists to this day as physics. Chemistry also got its start through philosophical inquiry by Newton's contemporary Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691. In the early 20th century, the philosopher William James, 1842 to 1910, founded the science of psychology. And in the middle of the 20th century, Noam Chomsky, 1928, combined philosophy with linguistics to get the new field of cognitive science started. There are similar origins in the social sciences. Ideals of government and forms of government topics now falling into the category of political science were first theorized by philosophers such as Plato. C. 428 c. 348 BCE, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, Thomas Aquinas. C. 1225 to 1274, Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, John Locke, 1632 to 1704, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, who is credited with developing the theoretical foundation of communism and socialism, modified the ideas of philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. The first systematic historian was a philosopher, Giovanni Battista, Giambattista, Vico. Also Vigo, 1668 to 1744, as was the first sociologist, the philosophical positivist Auguste Comte. Full name, Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte, 1798 to 1857. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, is usually credited with having founded anthropology. In the 20th century, social movements have received valuable inspiration from the work of philosophers. For instance, the women's movement from Simone de Beauvoir, 1908 to 1986, the civil rights movement from W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, the animal rights movement from Peter Singer, 1946. And the environmental preservation movement from Arnnes, 1912 to 2009, who introduced the term deep ecology.
Was Rousseau a hypocrite?
Based on his assumption that children were naturally good and that the purpose of education was to nurture this goodness. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, became the leading educational theorist of his age. His Émile, or, On Education, is a loving account of the development of a young boy under the guidance of Rousseau. The boy is raised in the countryside, where there are less corrupting influences and his mind is not taxed. Until he is 12. This is a progressive education set up to draw out the nature of the child. Nature wants children to be children before being men. Childhood has its own ways of seeing, thinking, and feeling. Émile then learns a skill, carpentry. And at 16 he is introduced to Sophie, who has been selected as his mate. Sophie has been educated to be governed, whereas Émile is taught the principles of self-government. Rousseau himself is said to have had 5 children by Thérèse Levasseur, and each one was brought to an orphanage at birth. Those individuals who already hated Rousseau, such as Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, pointed out that most children in orphanages at that time perished. Rousseau's only defense was that he did not think he would have been a good father. When a friend of Rousseau's noted that the course of education described in Émile was not practical, Rousseau wrote back, "You say quite correctly that it is impossible to produce an Émile. But I cannot believe that you take the book that carries this name for a true treatise on education. It is rather a philosophical work on this principle advanced by the author in other writings that man is naturally good." If Rousseau did not take himself seriously as an educational theorist, then his own behavior as a parent would not have meant that he was a hypocrite on that score. The question, however, remains whether this behavior qualifies him as naturally good. So the question of hypocrisy does not go away that easily.
Was the Vienna Circle an actual organization?
Yes, it was a discussion group of scientists and philosophers in Vienna, who held meetings from 1922 to 1938. Its members were highly influential in setting the subject matter of future analytic philosophy, ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of language, excluding ordinary language philosophy, and philosophy of mind.
What is property?
(1840), he famously proclaimed that property is theft.
What are some of Peter Singer's views?
Singer, 1946, has at times argued that the lives of healthy adult animals are of greater value than those of severely impaired human infants. Such views have met with great controversy. When Singer was hired by Princeton University in 1999, there were dramatic public demonstrations by and for disabled people. And the university administration hired armed guards to protect him. Singer, proceeding on utilitarian grounds, does not believe that animals have rights, but rather that their well-being is intrinsically good and their pain and destruction intrinsically bad. Singer is not a deep ecologist, because he does not attribute intrinsic value to the well-being of mountains, rivers, or plants, or whatever is not sentient. Singer has claimed that the privileging of human life and well-being over that of animals is speciesism, which, in principle, is no different from racism and sexism.
What is Mysterianism?
Mysterianism is the view that it is impossible for us to explain consciousness. This perspective, sometimes held by philosophers, is now called the New Mysterianism, and is based on the writings of Colin McGinn, 1950, such as The Problem of Consciousness. 1991, The Mysterious Flame, 1999, and Consciousness and Its Objects, 2004. The name New Mysterians was bestowed by Owen Flanagan, 1949, in his Science of the Mind. 1991, and it was based on the rock group and the Mysterians. Past philosophers such as Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, similarly believed that the emergence of consciousness could not be fully understood by conscious beings. What is striking about the New Mysterianism, though, is that it cropped up after almost a century of rigorous philosophical attempts to provide theories of consciousness and cognition. It is different from claiming, as Jerry Fodor, 1935, does, that we do not now know how the mind is connected to the body, because it claims that we can't ever know that, or even what the mind itself is. Some aspects of this thought are reminiscent of skepticism. In the ancient world and in the 16th century,
Why did John Stuart Mill distrust majority rule?
Mill argued in On Liberty, 1859, that the whole of society could be swayed by the mere opinions and passions of a majority. For this reason, free speech was essential. Even if those who seek to suppress free speech are correct, if they are not willing to present their arguments afresh, they might come to hold their correct conclusions as mere superstitions. Mill thus believed in freedom of opinion for its utility in promoting a generally rational pubic epistemology, or shared theory of what constitutes knowledge. He thought it was important that people have standards based on what is known as opposed to mere opinion. If there is free speech and public disagreement, then the parties that prevail have to give reasons for their views, according to Mill. In other words, Mill thought that free speech would encourage good arguments, and that good arguments would result in an informed public. Knowledge, according to Mill, required both reasoning and a justification of beliefs.
What were Søren Kierkegaard's stages of life's way?
Kierkegaard claimed that faith required choices in self-development through 3 stages on life's way. Each stage is a different viewpoint on life. First, there is the aesthetic life, lived in the moment, dedicated to the satisfaction of desire, and, in its refined form, to the appreciation of the arts. Lacking in this life is commitment. Commitment is found in the second stage in the ethical life, which seeks a unified self over time. The third stage is the religious life.
When did medicine become separate from philosophy?
Although Hippocrates of Kos II, or Hippocrates of Kos, c. 465 to 370 BCE, is credited with being the father of medicine, Aristotle and Theophrastus. 371 c. 287 BCE, wrote about Alcmaeon of Croton as the founder of medicine during the second half of the 6th century BCE. Alcmaeon also investigated the functions of the different senses. Because the process of understanding was similar to the rotations of the stars, he thought that the soul, like the stars, was immortal. He speculated that sense organs relayed information to the brain through passages. When blood moved to the large blood vessels, the result was sleep. Whereas when it became redistributed, the result was wakefulness. The specific nature of Alcmaeon's ideas, and his introduction to medicine of principles unique to that subject, forever changed the practice of medicine and systematic thought about the human body. As Alcmaeon's successor, Hippocrates, 465 to 370 BCE, was able to build on his thought and establish medicine as a science in its own right.
How was Johann Gottlieb Fichte's idealism connected to freedom?
Fichte thought that our spontaneity is something we can become aware of through reflection on ourselves as active beings, who think, as well as do things in the world. This entails that the ultimate reality is a transcendental ego, a locus of pure activity. Following Kant, Fichte meant that behind the self of which a person is aware while thinking, there is an unperceived self. Fichte believed that maturity was required to realize this freedom of the self. Those who were immature would cling to dogmatism.
Did the Eastern philosophers interact much with the St. Louis Hegelians?
Although they were not academic philosophers, the St. Louis philosophers were in conversation with the Eastern transcendental thinkers, such as those of the Concord School of Philosophy, which had been organized by William Harris. 1835 to 1909, and transcendentalist Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799 to 1888. The Concord School held conferences during the summer from 1879 to 1887, and when Alcott first visited Harris in St. Louis, he was abused by Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826 to 1906, in what the Hegelian observers called the first bout between East and West. The result was celebrated as a victory for the West. Another famed Eastern philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, also visited the St. Louis Philosophical Society.
Who was Princess Elizabeth?
This royal friend and student of Descartes was a powerful woman with an independent mind. Elizabeth, Electress Palatine and Queen of Bohemia, 1596 to 1662. Was the oldest daughter of James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark, his queen consort. Her descendants, the Hanoverians, were to occupy the British throne. In 1613 she married Frederick V, the Elector of the Palatine. An alliance designed to strengthen her father's ties to the Holy Roman Empire. Her husband was only briefly King of Bohemia, however, and after his exile, they lived in The Hague. In 1649, she entered a convent in Hertford in Westphalia, in what is now Germany, which she managed until her death. Elizabeth's interest in philosophy had a depth that was unusual for someone with her social and familial obligations. In 1643, she wrote Descartes, and I admit it would be easier for me to concede matter and extension to the soul than the capacity of moving a body and a being moved, to an immaterial being. For, if the first occurred through information, the spirits that perform the movement would have to be intelligent, which you accord to nothing corporeal. And although in your metaphysical meditations you show the possibility of the second, it is, however, very difficult to comprehend that a soul, as you have described it, after having had the faculty and habit of reasoning well, can lose all of it on account of some vapors, and that, although it can subsist without the body and has nothing in common with it, is yet so ruled by it.
What did Henry Sidgwick contribute to moral theory?
First, Sidgwick is considered to have offered the clearest exposition of the classic utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, to such an extent that he is often counted as a utilitarian himself. But second, it is his comparative assessment of egoism, utilitarianism, and intuitionism that remains most instructive. Egoism is the moral system according to which we should always act in our own self-interest. Sidgwick examined both common-sense moral principles and the main claims of all three systems and concluded that none is self-evident or certain according to intuition. He thought that utilitarianism could be useful when we do not know what to do and seek guidance, but that the basic principles of utilitarianism depend on intuition for their acceptance. But egoism also seems self-evident, and it often conflicts with utilitarianism. Sidgwick admitted that he could not resolve this contradiction.
What was Martin Heidegger's question concerning technology?
Heidegger's question was the same question that hangs over us at this time. Will technology destroy the world as we know it? But Heidegger's understanding of technology was unlike environmentalist thought that distinguished the artificial from what is natural. As part of what it means to say that the world worlds, Heidegger believed that technology was a process arising from being. Insofar as human beings are the custodians of being in their own being, albeit without a full understanding of what is involved in their relationship to being. Technology, according to Heidegger, was an enframing force and process that emerges from Dasein's relationship to being. All beings are marshaled and regimented to present themselves as uniform types of objects, human activities and the beauties of nature are also enframed and presented back to Dasein as items for use or consumption. In Heidegger's terms, a particularly plaintive example of such processing is the redirection and artificialization of the River Rhine as a tourist attraction. As part of his analysis of the historical force of technology that has arisen from a distinctively human understanding of being, Heidegger insists that technology is not an effect of science, but the reverse. Science and scientific research are no more than the results of more general technological forces.
What were some of the rather humorous experiments carried out by members of the British Royal Society?
The former British comedy troupe Monty Python would have had a field day with some of the early investigations conducted by the Royal Society. And King Charles II, who was very interested in experiments in general, loved to make fun of the more preposterous ones. For example, at the Philosophical Society of Oxford hosted by founding Royal Society Secretary John Wilkins, 1614 to 1672, who had written about the admirable contrivances of natural things in mathematical marvels there were, among Wilkins' own collection, transparent opearies and a hollow statue that spoke through a concealed pipe. Robert Boyle, 1627–1691, was considered eccentric because he doctored himself and seemed to make a hobby of collecting medical prescriptions. By the time the Royal Society had formed, alchemy had switched from being a science seeking to convert base metals into gold to one with an aim of using new medical discoveries to prolong human life. Nonetheless, in 1689 Boyle worked successfully to get Henry IV's law against multiplying gold repealed. When Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle upon Tyne, 1623–1673, was granted a visit to the Royal Society in 1667, she was shown experiments involving colors, the mixing of cold liquids, dissolving meat in oil of vitriol, weighing air, the flattening of marbles, magnetism, and a good microscope. The Duchess wrote in her own diary that the new science was useless for solving social and spiritual problems.
What was individually noteworthy about Diderot, d'Alembert, Holbach, and Montesquieu?
Denis Diderot, 1713–1784, was the general editor of the encyclopedia. His The Skeptic's Walk, 1747, was a robust attack on Christianity. His claim that the universe was wholly material and evolving, as asserted in Letter on the Blind, 1749, resulted in a brief imprisonment. Diderot's comedies were considered second-rate, but his literary analyses created the new genre of literary criticism. Jean-Léron d'Alembert, 1717–1783, was the chief philosopher in the Encyclopedists project. In his Discours préliminaire he divided a philosophy of man into pneumatology, or the human soul, logic, and ethics. He held that the substance of the universe cannot be known, and an essay on the elements of philosophy, 1759, defined the field as a comparison of phenomena, that is, appearances. Baron Paul Henry Dietrich de Holbach, 1723–1789, was a major contributor to the encyclopedia. He was a solicitor at the Paris Parliament and hosted philosophical dinners. He systematized Diderot's naturalism and published anonymous irreligious treatises applying philosophy against the Catholic Church. He argued that everything in existence was based on matter and motion in a completely determined universe. Holbach thought that Christian virtues were unnatural, that piety was fanaticism, and that church officials were immoral. He was also a utilitarian. Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, Charles Louis de Secondad, 1689–1755, was the chief political encyclopedist. His most famous work is The Spirit of the Laws, 1740–1748, in which he argued that governments can be divided into republics, monarchies, or despotisms, which are respectively motivated by political virtue, honor, and fear. Types of government depend on the character, history, and geography of a people. A constitutional government with a separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers is the only form that can protect liberty. This idea influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution.
Did W. V.O. Quine practice what he preached about philosophical relevance?
No, and many have been grateful for this. As a philosopher, Quine has been criticized for his ivory tower view of the field and his claim that philosophers are not particularly qualified for helping to get society on an even keel. However, in real life, Quine was very involved in resisting Nazism. After he visited Germany as a Harvard Fellow in the 1930s and met the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, he reacted against the Nazis' incursions into philosophy, one of which was an avowedly racist mathematical journal, Deutsche Mathematik, by volunteering for the U.S. Navy. After he returned to teaching at Harvard, he organized symposia and talks for members of the Vienna Circle from 1938 to 1941, particularly for Rudolf Carnap. 1891 to 1970, although Carnap was later hired by the University of Chicago. Quine also helped Alfred Tarski, 1902 to 1983, gain employment at City College in New York.
Who was Segovia?
Segovia, or Chief Red Jacket, 1757 to 1839, gave many speeches on the problems posed by diverse populations with different appearances and religions sharing the same country. In this sense, he anticipated 20th-century American concerns about racial difference and immigration.
Who was Alfred Tarski?
Alfred Tarski, 1902 to 1983, was a logician. Born in Poland, he taught at the University of California at Berkeley from 1942 to 1958. He is famous for his theory of truth that appeared in The Concept of Truth in Formalized Languages, 1933. Which appeared in the Polish journal Prastorstwo Naukowego Warszawskiego, Wigel 3 Nok Mate Matizno Fizesnik, and was translated into English in Logic, Semantics, Metamathematics, papers from 1923 to 1938, 1983. According to Tarski, any theory of truth should imply the truth of T sentences in natural languages. For example, snow is white in English is true if and only if snow is white is a sentence. It is important to notice that Tarski's theory of truth does not specify what constitutes truth but is rather about how true sentences can be defined.
What kind of life did Ralph Waldo Emerson lead?
Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, lost his father when he was just 8 years old, and was sent to Boston Latin School the next year. He attended Harvard College at 14, where he waited on tables at the Commons and tutored to pay for his education. After graduation, he helped his brother in a school for young ladies, which his mother ran in her home. In 1829 Emerson graduated from Harvard Divinity School as a Unitarian minister. But he resigned from that vocation in 1832 because of a disagreement with church administrators. He had married Ellen Louisa Tucker in 1829, but she died of tuberculosis 2 years later at the age of 20. He mourned her deeply, but had also described himself as strangely attracted to a young man while at Harvard, and was later believed to become infatuated with other young men, including author Nathaniel Hawthorne. During travels in Europe after his wife died, Emerson met authors William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Thomas Carlyle. He would correspond with Carlyle 1795 to 1881 until his death in 1881, and philosopher John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. In 1835 Emerson bought a house in Concord, Massachusetts, and married Lydia Jackson, with whom he had 4 children. He was reasonably well off financially, partly due to a lawsuit securing his inheritance from his first wife, and he used part of the money to help Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799 to 1888, his neighbor. Many considered Emerson the greatest orator of his day.
What is Julia Kristova's idea of the object and the nature of women?
Kristeva has emphasized the rejection of mothers by both male and female children due to male-dominated cultural patterns that render the mother herself abject, which is to say, totally other, disgusting, and monstrous. Kristeva thinks that the solution to this problem requires a rediscovery and healing of narcissism in women's psyches and an acceptance of adult love between women. However, Kristeva rejects the label woman as a universal term, and has refused to define women. She apparently believes that every woman is fundamentally different in how she is a woman or what being a woman means. As she wrote, it is there, in the analysis of her difficult relation to her mother and to her own difference from everybody else, men and women, that a woman encounters the enigma of the feminine. I favor an understanding of femininity that would have as many feminines as there are women. Kristova's main theoretical writings are, About Chinese Women, 1977, Desire in Language, A Semiotic Approach to Literature and Art, 1980, Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection, 1982, Revolution in Poetic Language, 1984, and New Maladies of the Soul, 1995.
Who is Daniel C. Dennett?
Daniel C. Dennett, 1942, is an American philosopher of mind and science. He is professor of philosophy at Tufts University and co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies there. He has been influential in combining cognitive science and evolutionary theory in philosophy of biology. Most notably in these works, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Evolution and the Meanings of Life, 1996. Kinds of Minds, Towards an Understanding of Consciousness, 1997, Brain Children, Essays on Designing Minds. Representation and Mind, 1998, Freedom Evolves, 2003, Sweet Dreams, Philosophical Obstacles to a Science of Consciousness. 2005, and Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, 2006. Dennett is also a supporter of the Brights movement.